before it was the city that never sleeps, New York was something quieter, stranger, and far more vulnerable. If you could stand at the southern tip of Manhattan in the 1700s, you would see a place that barely resembles the metropolis we know today. The island stretches north into wilderness. The city itself clings to the harbour like a child holding onto its mother's hand. There are no skyscrapers here, no bridges connecting the boroughs, no subway rumbling beneath your feet, just wooden houses, church steeples, and the constant presence of water. This is New York in the 18th century, a city caught between empires, shaped by trade, scarred by war, and built on the backs of the enslaved. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost in a single voyage, where languages from 4 continents mixed in the streets, and where the future of a nation was quietly taking shape in taverns and marketplaces. Let's walk these streets together and see what this city was before it became New York. In the early 1700s, Manhattan was not yet fully tamed. The southern tip was dense with buildings, but venture north past the commons, and you would find yourself in farmland, forests and marshes. The Collect Pond sat in the centre of the lower island, a body of fresh water surrounded by hills. It was beautiful then, used for fishing and ice skating in winter. No one could have imagined it would one day become a dumping ground, filled in and paved over to make room for the growing city. The shoreline itself was different. The East River waterfront was jagged and irregular, filled with small coves and inlets. Pearl Street, which runs through the financial district today, was named for the oyster shells that once lined the shore. The Hudson Riverside was quieter, less developed, with a few estates belonging to wealthy families. Between these two rivers, the island rose and fell in gentle slopes, carved by streams that have long since disappeared. If you looked at a map from this period, you would see streets that still exist today. Broadway already cut diagonally across the grid, following an old native path called the Wick-Quaskek Trail. Wall Street marked the northern boundary of the original settlement, named for the wooden wall built by the Dutch to keep out the English and native raids. That wall is gone now, but the name remains, a ghostly reminder of the city's anxious beginnings. The English took control of the city in 1664, renaming it after the Duke of York. But the transformation was not immediate. For decades, Dutch influence lingered in the architecture, the language, and the people. You could still hear Dutch spoken in the markets well into the 1700s. The step-gabled houses with their steep roofs and brick facades stood side by side with newer English structures. It was a city learning to speak 2 languages at once. The transition brought tension. The English imposed new laws, new taxes, and a new sense of order. The Dutch families who had built their wealth under the old regime had to adjust or risk losing everything. Some thrived, others faded into obscurity. The city itself became a kind of negotiation, a place where competing traditions collided and slowly blended into something new. By the early 1700s, the English character of the city was becoming more pronounced. The churches reflect this shift. Trinity Church, an Anglican institution, rose at the head of Wall Street in 1698. Its steeple dominated the skyline, a visual assertion of English authority. But just a few blocks away, the old Dutch Reformed Church still held services, its congregation clinging to the language and customs of their ancestors. New York's lifeblood was its harbour. The port was not as large as Boston's or Philadelphia's in the early 1700s, but it was growing fast. Ships arrived from the Caribbean loaded with sugar and molasses. Others came from England carrying textiles, tools and luxuries. The docks along the East River were constantly busy, a tangle of ropes, barrels and shouting men. The smell of tar, salt and fish hung in the air. The markets near the waterfront were chaotic and loud. Merchants haggled over prices. Sailors fresh off the boat wandered through, looking for drink and company. Enslaved Africans unloaded cargo under the watch of overseers. The economy here was built on the triangle trade, a system of horror and profit that connected New York to Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South. Sugar, rum, and human lives moved through this port in a brutal cycle. Taverns lined the streets near the docks. These were not just places to drink, they were where business was done, where news was exchanged, where alliances were formed and broken. Fraunces Tavern, which still stands today, was a gathering place for merchants and ship captains. The conversations here shaped the flow of goods and money through the city. In the dim light of oil lamps, Deals were struck that would ripple across the Atlantic. The wealth generated by this trade was visible in the homes of the merchant class. Along the waterfront and up Broadway, grand houses began to appear, built of brick and stone, with large windows and fine furnishings imported from Europe. These homes announced their owner's success. But that success came at a cost borne by others. Behind the prosperity was a dependence on slavery that would shape the city for generations. New York in the 1700s had one of the largest enslaved populations of any city in the American colonies. By mid-century, nearly 1 in 5 residents was enslaved. They worked in homes as domestic servants. They laboured on the docks, loading and unloading ships. They built the infrastructure of the growing city, laying streets and constructing buildings. Their presence was everywhere, but their voices were silenced. The conditions were harsh. Enslaved people in New York had few legal protections. They could be bought and sold at will. Families were separated. Punishments were brutal. In 1712, a group of enslaved Africans rose up in rebellion, setting fire to buildings and attacking their enslavers. The uprising was crushed quickly, and the retribution was savage. 21 people were executed, some burned alive, others hanged or broken on the wheel. The city responded with even harsher laws, tightening control and deepening the cruelty of the system. In 1741, fear swept through the city again. A series of fires broke out and rumours spread of a conspiracy among the enslaved population to burn the city down. The trials that followed were a dark mirror of the Salem witch trials. Over 100 people were arrested, 13 were burned at stake, 17 were hanged. 4 white people were also executed, accused of helping the plot. Historians still debate whether the conspiracy was real or a product of paranoia, but the violence was undeniable. Slavery in New York was not a distant abstraction. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. The wealth of the city, the comfort of its elite, the growth of its economy, all of it rested on the exploitation of enslaved labour. To understand New York in the 1700s, you must see this truth clearly. The city was built by people who were never free to enjoy what they created. Walking through New York in the mid-1700s, you would be struck by how small and crowded it felt. The streets were narrow and unpaved, turning to mud after every rain. Pigs and dogs wandered freely, scavenging for food. There were no sewers, no streetlights, no clean water systems. Waste was thrown into the streets or into the rivers. Disease spread easily in these conditions, and epidemics of smallpox and yellow fever swept through the city with grim regularity. The population was diverse in a way that surprised visitors. English, Dutch, French Huguenots, Germans, Africans, Caribbean islanders, and native peoples all lived within a few square miles. You could hear multiple languages in a single block. This diversity was not celebrated, but it was unavoidable. The city needed labourers, merchants, and craftsmen, and they came from wherever they could. The buildings reflected this mix. Dutch-style homes with their distinctive gables stood next to English Georgian townhouses. Wooden structures leaned against brick warehouses. The architecture was practical rather than grand, shaped by the needs of a working port city. Fires were a constant danger, and the city had no organised fire department. When flames broke out, residents formed bucket brigades, but entire blocks could be lost before the fire was contained. Church bells marked the rhythm of the day. They rang for services, for emergencies, for the opening and closing of markets. Religion played a central role in public life, but it was also a source of division. Anglicans, Dutch Reformed, Presbyterians, Quakers, and a small Jewish community all coexisted, sometimes uneasily. The first synagogue in North America was established in New York in 1730, a modest building that served a community of Sephardic Jews who had fled persecution in Europe and Brazil. The 18th century brought near-constant conflict to New York, positioned at the crossroads of imperial ambition. European wars spilled into the colonies, reshaping the city through cycles of violence and upheaval. During King George's War in the 1740s, New York strengthened fortifications as militias drilled and privateers hunted French ships. The 7 Years' War, 1754-1763, brought deeper disruption. New York became a British staging ground against French Canada. Troops marched through streets, supplies were requisitioned, and military contracts flooded the economy. Shipyards and merchants prospered from war's demands. The though prosperity came with tension as soldiers clashed with civilians in increasingly dangerous streets. Yet this prosperity came at a cost. The presence of thousands of soldiers brought inevitable tension to the streets. Fights broke out regularly between locals and redcoats, often over women, gambling debts, or simple territorial disputes between civilians and military men who saw the city as theirs to command. The taverns grew rowdy and dangerous after dark, places where violence could erupt without warning. Military discipline clashed with civilian freedoms, and resentments festered on both sides. The war ended in 1763 with a resounding British victory that secured Canada and vast Western territories for the Crown. But this triumph left the British Empire deeply in debt, having spent enormous sums prosecuting a global conflict. The Crown's ministers decided that the American colonies, having benefited from British military protection, should help pay for their own defence going forward. This seemingly reasonable policy would ignite a firestorm of resistance that would ultimately tear the empire apart. The Stamp Act of 1765 hit New York particularly hard. This legislation taxed all printed materials, from newspapers and pamphlets to legal documents and playing cards, requiring that they bear an embossed revenue stamp. For a city whose commercial life depended on contracts, bills of lading, and newspapers, the impact was immediate and infuriating. The tax sparked outrage across all classes of society. Protests erupted in the streets with a fury that surprised British officials. Effigies of stamp distributors and British ministers were paraded through the streets before being burned in public spectacles that drew hundreds of onlookers. A group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty organised systematic resistance to the Stamp Act. They intimidated stamp distributors, making it physically dangerous for anyone to sell or distribute the hated stamps. They organised boycotts of British goods, pressuring merchants to refuse imports from England until the Act was repealed. Their tactics combined political theatre with genuine threats of violence, creating an atmosphere where royal authority could not function effectively. The tensions continued to escalate throughout the late 1760s. In January 1760, British soldiers clashed violently with protesters in what became known as the Battle of Golden Hill, a brutal skirmish fought with clubs, bayonets and swords near the site of the present-day Brooklyn Bridge. Several people were seriously wounded in the fighting, which occurred just weeks before the more famous Boston Massacre. This confrontation foreshadowed the full-scale war that was rapidly approaching. New York was becoming a hotbed of revolutionary sentiment, even as many of its wealthiest and most established citizens remained steadfastly loyal to the Crown. The city was splitting along political, economic and social lines that grew deeper with each passing year. Merchants whose fortunes depended on trade with Britain often remained loyal, as did many Anglican church members and those with official positions in the colonial government. Meanwhile, artisans, small merchants, and those excluded from political power increasingly embraced radical ideas about independence and self-governance. By the 1770s, New York had become a city perpetually on edge. The economy remained strong, with ships continuing to crowd the harbour and goods flowing through the warehouses that lined the waterfront. But political tensions made the future profoundly uncertain. Loyalists and patriots eyed each other with open suspicion on the streets. Committees of correspondence spread radical political ideas through networks that reached into every neighbourhood. Printers churned out pamphlets and broadsides arguing passionately for independence or warning with equal fervour of the chaos and bloodshed that rebellion would bring. The city's taverns, coffeehouses and public spaces were filled with heated debate, passionate arguments that sometimes turned violent when political opponents encountered each other. The city's strategic importance made it a prize that both sides desperately wanted to control. New York's magnificent natural harbour could supply and shelter an entire army or fleet. Its central location geographically connected New England to the middle and southern colonies, making it a crucial link in any continental strategy. The Hudson River provided a water route deep into the interior, potentially allowing an army to cut the rebellious colonies in half. Whoever controlled New York would possess a significant military, economic and psychological advantage in any coming war. Both the British High Command and revolutionary leaders understood this fundamental strategic reality, and they prepared their plans accordingly. When the American Revolution finally erupted into open warfare in 1775, with the battles at Lexington and Concord, New York's fate was effectively sealed. The city would become a major battlefield in 1776, when George Washington's Continental Army attempted to defend it against a massive British invasion force. The British would successfully capture the city after a series of defeats for the Americans, and New York would remain under British occupation for the remainder of the war, from 1776 until 1783. Its population became divided and traumatised, with thousands of loyalists fleeing to the city for British protection, while patriots escaped to support the revolutionary cause. The New York of the 1700s, that bustling port city caught between competing empires, would be utterly transformed by fire, occupation, and conflict into something fundamentally new. The New York of the 18th century is physically gone, swept away by centuries of development and change. The wooden houses that lined its streets have long since been replaced by brick, stone, steel, and glass. The shoreline has been dramatically reshaped by landfill projects that pushed the waterfront hundreds of feet into what was once the East River and Hudson River. The Collect Pond, once a prominent geographical feature and source of fresh water, is now buried deep beneath streets and buildings in what is now Chinatown. Yet the patterns and structures established in that tumultuous era still echo powerfully through the city today. The irregular street grid of Lower Manhattan, so different from the orderly grid imposed uptown in the 19th century, preserves the medieval layout of the Dutch and English colonial city. The harbour economy that made New York wealthy in the 1700s evolved directly into the port that made it America's greatest commercial centre. The cultural diversity that characterised 18th century New York, with its mix of Dutch, English, African, Jewish and other populations, foreshadowed the immigrant city it would become. And tragically, the deep inequalities between rich and poor, free and enslaved, powerful and powerless that marked colonial society have roots that remain disturbingly relevant. This was a city built by many hands, some free, most decidedly not. It was shaped simultaneously by ambition and greed, by human creativity and casual cruelty. It was a place where empires clashed violently, while ordinary people simply tried to build lives and support families amid chaos and uncertainty. To walk through the streets of 18th century New York, even in imagination, is to see the rough and unfinished foundations of the modern metropolis, unmistakably present beneath centuries of subsequent development. These historical images, careful reconstructions, and old engravings bring us as close as we can possibly get to a vanished world. They remind us that history is not merely dates to memorise and battles to catalogue. It is streets walked daily and markets where people haggled. It is homes where families lived and harbours where ships arrived with news from distant places. It is real people living, working, struggling, loving and dying in a time that, despite surface differences, was not so fundamentally different from our own. The New York we know today grew directly out of this earlier city, carrying forward both its tremendous promise and its terrible sins. Thank you for walking these vanished streets with me. The past is never truly gone. It lives in the stones beneath our feet, in the names of our streets, and most importantly in the choices we make today.